welcome to Occult Readings, episode 272. We're on to the first half of the 10th chapter in The Problem of Slavery in the Age of Revolution. So, let's just get on into it here. Bear with me a second here. There we go. All right, now let's get into it. So, like I said, chapter 10, and it is titled Anti-Slavery and the Conflict of Laws. And he starts it off with an introduction, which is a little different. So, introduction. The anti-slavery movement reflected and contributed to the major passage in intellectual history only indirectly related to the political and economic controversies of the Age of Revolution. Disputes over sanction gravitated inevitably toward fundamental principles as exemplified in Granville Sharp's attempt to prove by the early 1770s that any claim to private property, quote, in the persons of men, end quote, violated both divine and human law. Presumably, the following century vindicated Sharp's contention, though not without accompanying transformations in the prevailing views of divine and human law, transformations which Sharp could neither have foreseen nor approved. By appealing to abstract systems of law, precedent, and principle, the critics of slavery offered a covert challenge to some of the more enduring structures of Western culture. In chapters 10 and 11, I turn to two testing points of tradition: the conflict of human laws and the changing interpretations of the Word of God. In 1776, Samuel Hopkins found the illegality of Negro slavery as self-evident as a geometric theorem. If the slave trade was wrong in 1776, it had always been wrong, and if it had always been criminal to capture and enslave innocent Africans, then it was no less criminal to hold them and their descendants in continuing bondage. In 1820, when Elihu Embry submitted a similar argument to the Tennessee legislature, the slave trade had been outlawed by Britain and declared piracy by the United States. Quote, "Of course it follows," Embry wrote, "when this is admitted, that titles obtained to men in this way have no foundation in justice, and can never become just, though handed down from father to son for 1,000 generations." End quote. This was essentially the quote-unquote higher law doctrine advanced in 1760 by George Wallace, who felt that judges had the duty to restore Negro slaves to their rightful liberty. It was one thing, however, to state abstract propositions which could be countered by other abstract propositions, and quite another to decide how the law applied to a particular case. Judges in both Europe and America recognized claims to slave property even where no municipal law defined a mode of legitimate enslavement or the nature of a master's dominion. Slaves had long been treated in international trade as articles of commerce and in war as contraband. They were the subjects of international treaties and of conventions for the mutual return of fugitives. Like other chattel property, they could be taxed or seized for debt, and were subject to municipal laws governing wills, estates, and contracts. Slave owners often traveled or changed their place of domicile. They sometimes lived thousands of miles from their slaves, under different or conflicting systems of law. The courts of one country could not deny proprietorship in slaves without raising a web of tangled issues regarding status, contractual rights, jurisdiction, and the comity of states. By questioning the legality of human property, the anti-slavery movement evoked significant responses and compromises from the makers and interpreters of law. After the Somerset decision of 1772, it was no longer possible to take for granted the universal legality of slave property. Yet courts of law are not revolutionary tribunals, nor do they often issue sweeping verdicts that ignore the intricacies of property relations. The English common law courts of the 18th century were almost invariably preoccupied with private, not public, issues. Parliamentary supremacy, according to Brian Abel Smith and Robert Stevens, quote, reduced the common law of England to the status of a delegated system. Not only had constitutional issues to be settled by Parliament, but the logic of the position was that even changes in private law had to be sanctioned by the legislature, end quote. Excuse me. Judges ordinarily stuck close to the specific issues at hand and took pains to limit the legal effects of their decisions. There was thus a considerable gap between the enthusiasm of abolitionists and the judicial decisions restricting slavery, a gap that produced both misunderstanding and later judicial confusion. If slavery was contrary to natural law, were there any constitutional means by which courts could declare it illegal without becoming lawmaking bodies? Was the institution analogous to polygamy, which was presumed to be illegal except where sanctioned by municipal law? Or was the possession of slaves like the possession of cats or horses, which was presumed to be legal except where explicitly outlawed? Did the slave's status derive from African law, from colonial law, from contract, or from ancient laws of English servitude? Did the Comity of States protect the property rights of masters who traveled with their slaves to quote-unquote free soil areas? Was the status of a slave or master analogous to the status of a married person whose marriage has been validly performed under the laws of another jurisdiction? If so, how could free countries prevent an influx of slave-owning residents from subverting public policy? Did the principle of comity extend to the return of fugitives, or did the outlawing of slavery create a sanctuary of freedom? Property versus legal personality. The gradual disappearance of slavery from most parts of Europe gave force to the ancient principle of in favorem libertatis, which in theory meant that a court might presume any servant was free, subject only to contract, unless his master could prove some hereditary right of ancient dominion. In England, the procedural devices and presumptions of common law helped to manumit many villains. In 16th century France, the Parliament of Guyenne, that's Guienne, I'm going to say Guyenne, ruled that, and it's in French, of course. I can only pick out like two words there: France and liberty. Um, sorry. Sergeant at Law William Davy, in the opening argument in behalf of the slave James Somerset, referred to the 1640 impeachment of the judges of the Star Chamber when the managers of the House of Commons cited the unrecorded case of Cartwright, who had brought a slave from Russia to England. In the 11th year of Elizabeth's reign, Davy exclaimed it had been solved that, quote, England was too pure an air for slaves to breathe in, end quote. In fact, in point of fact, Negro slaves were bought and displayed in the courts of Elizabeth and her Stuart successors. They were publicly advertised for sale through most of the 18th century, and they were bequeathed in wills as late as the 1820s. Nevertheless, early in the 18th century, Lord Chief Justice Holt expressed the opinion that, quote, as soon as a Negro comes into England, he becomes free, end quote. In 1762, the Lord Chancellor laid down the maxim that, quote, as soon as a man puts foot on English ground, he is free. A Negro may maintain an action against his master for ill usage, and may have a habeas corpus if restrained of his liberty, end quote. 3 years later, in the first edition of his Commentaries on the Laws of England, Blackstone gloried in the knowledge that, quote, this spirit of liberty is so deeply implanted in our Constitution and rooted even in our very soil that a slave or Negro, the moment he lands in England, falls under the protection of the laws, and with regard to all natural rights becomes eo instanti a free man. End quote. These eloquent opinions, supported by the far more ancient doctrine that slavery was contrary to natural law, seemed to validate Lord Mansfield's reported statement in the Somerset case that, quote, the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. End quote. This judgment raises a number of general problems. Negro slavery had been established in the New World not by positive law but by impromptu decisions, the quote, reasons, occasion, and time, end quote, of which were soon erased from memory. In the Caribbean, Virginia, Maryland, and the Middle colonies, for example, the law had come after the fact, giving validation by gradual regulation. The early history of New World slavery gave credence to the claim that the institution arose from international trade and custom and required no other authorization. Although international law had a belated development in England, Francis Hargrave, one of Somerset's attorneys, acknowledged the opinions of civilians of quote unquote civilians of great credit, end quote, including Hugo Grotius, Samuel Puffendorf, and Ulricus Huberus, who had insisted on the legality of human slavery. According to leading continental authorities on the laws of nations, common practice proved the utility of an institution which natural reason could permit, if not sanction, and which judicial tribunals were therefore bound in some ways to uphold, especially when they turned from private obligations to the larger affairs of state. Even Somerset's counsel conceded that English courts would have to give effect to a contract for the purchase of slaves abroad. Lord Mansfield affirmed that English law would respect and give effect to such agreements, as as it in fact continued to do even after West Indian emancipation. There was thus some logic to Edward Long's contention that a contract sanctioned by English courts and by international custom could not be dissolved by the mere removal of the property to England. The African states, Long also pointed out, had as good a right as any European power to banish their criminals to any part of the world that would receive them. Nor could Englishmen challenge the validity of African justice, unless they were prepared to argue that innocent Englishmen were never banished or executed. Occasional injustices could not be allowed to invalidate the rules required for law and order. Long was by no means the only 18th century British subject who thought of the social compact as, quote, an association of the opulent and the good, for better preserving their acquisitions against the poor and the wicked, for want complicated with misery and vice, generally seeks relief by plundering from those who are better provided. An African is as much bound by this supreme power as the English laborer. End quote. After the Somerset decision, it was reassuring to think that slavery had always been repugnant to English law, and that ignorance alone had muddied judicial verdicts. Yet both Crown and Parliament had given open encouragement to the African slave trade. Prior to the American Revolution, the government had repeatedly disallowed colonial laws restricting slave imports. No one could doubt that positive law subjected colonial slave property to the claims of English creditors. In 18th century England, there was nothing faintly resembling judicial review of parliamentary legislation. Lord Mansfield emphasized that while he had the power to declare the law as it applied in the case of Somerset, he could neither make nor create a law to fit the occasion. He was, in fact, much concerned about the effects of his decision on property rights and suggested that English slaveholders might seek redress by appealing to Parliament. Pause. In what appears to be the most accurate text of his statement on positive law, he based his judgment on a doctrine of judicial restraint. Quote, the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being now introduced by courts of justice upon mere reasoning or inferences from any principles, natural or political. It must take its rise from positive law. The origin of it can in no country or age be traced back to any other source. Immemorial usage preserves the memory of positive law long after all traces of the occasion, reason, authority, and time of its introduction are lost, and in a case so odious as the condition of slaves must be taken strictly. End quote. The, early, the earlier judicial cases concerning Negroes had little to do with the laws of nations, maritime law, or even the legality of slavery in England. Rather, they involved civil disputes over the ownership of individual slaves, some of whom had obtained de facto freedom in England and had been employed for wages. In legal terms, the plaintiff commonly instituted an action of trespass or trover, the latter being a way of recovering the value of personal property wrongly converted by another for his own use. The specific issue raised by such actions was whether English laws protecting personal property could be extended to protecting the owners of errant slaves. The number of slaves in England was relatively small, and the question appeared to raise no conflicts of vital interest prior to the Somerset case. Oh, sorry, there was a break there. Prior to the Somerset case, the owners of West Indian slaves had little reason either to fear English public policy or to try to universalize slavery by pushing English courts towards a Dred Scott decision. The courts, however, faced a genuine dilemma. During the 17th century, the jurisdiction of common law courts, resting on a variety of traditional writs, had steadily encroached upon the domain of the Court of Admiralty. The latter had been attuned to the quote-unquote custom of merchants and to the principles of international mercantile law, which drew on Roman and continental precedents. Since the common law had been shaped by local customs regarding land tenure, status, and contract, it often ran counter to the interests and practices of the merchant community. Lord Mansfield, as Chief Justice of the Court of King's Bench, did much to adapt common law to the needs of merchants, especially by accepting the validity of customs which could not be defined as "immemorial." Yet he could not escape the contradiction between an alien form of commercial property and common law traditions of domestic liberty. In 18th century England, there was no coherent body of labor law, but rather a hodgepodge of statutes, precedents, and rules of equity. As judges soon realized, there were no rules for regulating the subjects of a labor system totally foreign to the path of English development. Yet judicial decisions on slavery could be a testing ground which might help to define and clarify that path of development. In a nation where labor itself was rapidly becoming a depersonalized commodity, the economy required a consistent and predictable distinction between work discipline and personal rights. The defenders of slavery, pointing to the dependent status of wives and minors, argued that the bondsmen received subsistence and protection in return for labor. The analogy between slaves and wives carried some weight given the legal incapacities of married women, but the notion of absolute dependency could not easily be reconciled with established theories of contract and legal consideration. It also ran counter to the central doctrine of legal personality. The new economic man would work not for an individual master, but for his own legal personality. It was this abstraction that made him responsible for his contractual obligations, for the support of his family, and for his debts. Personal dominion versus service. For slaveholding plaintiffs, the clearest course was to argue that Negroes were merchandise commonly bought and sold by European traders in accordance with the recognized law of nations. It was legally more hazardous for a court to acknowledge property rights in a Negro because he was a heathen or infidel. Such discrimination implied that baptism might bring the reward of freedom, as it did in certain jurisdictions under the rules of the East India Company. This question was ostensibly resolved in 1729 by the negative opinions of Sir Philip Yorke, the Attorney General, and Charles Talbot, the Solicitor General. Even Sergeant Davy conceded the point in the Somerset trial, perhaps out of deference to Lord Mansfield's known conviction that baptism could not alter legal status, but the growing consensus on baptism in effect eliminated the plea of religion as an excuse for enslavement. In 1706, Chief Justice Holt dismissed a trover action involving a Negro, since the law took no notice of Negroes being different from other men. When Sir Philip Yorke became Lord Chancellor and Lord Hardwicke, he pointed out that the description presented to Holt in 1706 should have read Negro slave, since being a Negro did not necessarily imply being a slave. Hardwicke, who did much to fashion the modern system of equity, and who was much revered by Mansfield, his pupil, went beyond the trover issue and twice ruled that a Negro slave remained a slave when brought to England. Yet the word slave carried connotations of personal dominion, discipline, and control which were difficult to assimilate to English law. Samuel Estwick, the assistant agent for Barbados, expressed confidence that the Somerset case would have had a different outcome if Charles Stuart, the master, had claimed Somerset as his "commercial property." This would have conformed with the 1729 opinions of Yorke and Talbot, which were much respected by Lord Mansfield, and would also have prevented irrelevant debates on villanage. Estwick, who called slavery an "odious word," thought the issues should have been strictly limited to trade and property, as might have been the case in the Court of Admiralty. In a sense, the framers of the United States Constitution later took Estwick's course and avoided the odious word while giving comfort and protection to the owners of slaves. It was impossible, however, for common law courts, governed as they were by ancient writs and procedures, to separate property rights from questions of status and dominion. Personal dominion was the point at issue in Somerset. In 1769, Charles Stuart brought his slave James Somerset from Virginia to England. In October 1771, Somerset deserted his master, and a month later was seized by Stuart's agents and locked in chains aboard a Jamaica-bound ship. In deciding to sell the Negro in Jamaica, Stuart acted not only as a property owner, but as a master disciplining a rebellious servant. Before the ship sailed, Lord Mansfield granted a writ of habeas corpus, ordering the ship's captain to bring Somerset to court and to file a return showing the cause of detainer. On December 9th, Captain John Knowles produced "the body of Somerset," together with a return which appealed to the acknowledged legality of the slave trade and British colonial slavery, and which argued that Somerset had been brought as a slave from Africa to Virginia, whose laws obliged him to serve for life. During his temporary stay in England, Somerset had, "without the consent and against the will of the said Charles Stuart, and without any lawful authority whatsoever, departed and absenteed himself from the service of the said Charles Stuart, and absolutely refused to return." Lord Mansfield had no doubts that the law should enforce obligations of personal service. Moreover, when slaves brought to England had occasionally been impressed into military service, he had used writs of habeas corpus to deliver the slaves back to their lawful masters. Though determined to avoid the question of the legality of slavery in England, he was unsure whether the cause on the return was sufficient, or more precisely whether English law recognized a species of dominion that would allow a master to ship an unruly servant out of the kingdom. In earlier cases, such as Chamberlain versus Harvey, 1696 and 1697, plaintiffs had used villenage as evidence that English law accepted a state of nearly absolute personal dominion. Everyone agreed that no English court had heard a claim of villenage since the early 17th century. Following the lead of Granville Sharp, Sergeants Davy and John Glynn opened the case for Somerset by describing villenage as the relic of a tyrannical age. Its extinction, said Davy, was, quote, nothing more than a general assertion of the natural rights of mankind, according to the temper, disposition, and spirit of the people of this country, end quote. But English judges were not prepared to agree, along with Condorcet and Granville Sharp, that precedents should be impeached by a quote unquote higher law of reason. If villenage had disappeared, it was not for that reason illegal. Lord Mansfield expressed the conviction that villenage regardant to a manor had been abolished by statute, yet he and lawyers on both sides acknowledged that in theory a man might still confess himself to be a villain in gross in order to escape, for example, the claims of creditors or other liabilities that legally fell on his master. Moreover, even Francis Hargrave, who joined in the final defense of Somerset, conceded that, quote, the condition of a villain had most of the incident had most of the incidents which I have before described in giving the idea of slavery in general. His service was uncertain and indeterminate, such as his lord thought fit to require, or, as some of our ancient writers express it, he knew not in the evening what he was to do in the morning. He was bound to do whatever he was commanded. He was liable to beating, imprisonment, and every other chastisement his lord might prescribe, except killing and maiming. He was incapable of acquiring property for his own benefit. He was himself the subject of property, as such saleable and transmissible. Lastly, the slavery extended to the issue. End quote. But it was a serious mistake, as Samuel Estwick realized, for slaveholders to appeal to the precedent or analogy of villenage. Refining and improving upon the arguments of Davy and Glynn, Hargrave explained that villenage was always local and prescriptive, extending over a, quote, time whereof no memory runs to the contrary, end quote. It was necessary for a lord to prove that villenage was ancient and immemorial, that the condition had passed without interruption through the blood of a long line of ancestors. If a villain, vil, if a villain could show that he was a bastard or in any other way cast doubt on the certainty of his ancestry, he had a legitimate claim to freedom. Obviously, this kind of servitude could not apply to foreigners or to any form of dominion or disability originating outside England. Hargrave's position was both stronger and subtler than Sharp's idealistic view that villenage had always been illegal and had finally been abolished by a triumphant common law. Hargrave conceded that English law authorized a kind of slavery, yet the same living law excluded, quote, every slavery not commencing in England, every slavery though commencing there not, being ancient and immemorial, end quote. In other words, the only slavery that could be legal in England was that which had long been extinct. The precedent of villanage also made slaveholders vulnerable by confusing the distinction between claims to property and claims to personal service. Though villeins were saleable and transmissible, as Hargrave said, their hereditary obligation to serve a particular family stood out above any theoretical marketability. The terms in gross and regardant indicated the modes by which a lord could plead his title to a villain, the former referring to a deed or confession, and the latter to the manor itself. Hargrave cited a trespass case in which the defendant pleaded that the plaintiff was a villain regardant to his manor, but the plaintiff claimed that his great-grandfather had been born in a different county, and that the connection between his ancestors and the manor had thus begun, quote, within time of memory, end quote. The property element was crucial in establishing title, but was clearly subordinate to the claim of service. In the trespass case of Chamberlain versus Harvey, which received lengthy discussion in the Somerset trial, and which involved an action brought by an heir for the recovery of a Negro employed in England as a free worker, the plaintiff's counsel argued that the status of a Barbadian slave was analogous to that of a villain regardant to a manor. The court decided that a trespass action could not be sustained for a Negro who could only be termed a slavish servant, quote unquote. The master could recover for loss of service, but not for the value of the servant. This precedent seemed important to Stuart's, nominally Captain Knowles's, counsel, who rightly feared that Somerset might be discharged without compensation to Stuart for loss of service. They pointed out that in Chamberlain, the court would have accepted an action per quod servitium amicit for loss of service, that, quote, if they allowed the means of suing a right, they allowed the right. The opinion cited to prove the Negroes free on coming hither only, quote, if they allowed the means of suing a right, they allowed the right. The opinion cited to prove the Negroes free on coming hither only declares them not saleable, does not take away their service, end quote. Stuart's counsel sought to establish, therefore, that Stuart's claim did not require that either trover or trespass should be admissible for a Negro. It is conceivable that slaveholders would have fared better in English courts if they had consistently developed this position. As we have seen, Lord Mansfield looked favorably on Masters' claims to service. He urged the parties in Somerset and other cases to reach agreement outside of court, much to the dismay and anger of Granville Sharp. Even William Blackstone, to whom Sharp confidently appealed for legal advice, thought that a master's right to service might continue after bringing the slave to England. I have already quoted Blackstone's idealistic view expressed in the first edition, 1765, of his commentaries, that, quote, a slave or Negro, the moment he lands in England, falls under the protection of the laws, and with regard to all natural rights, becomes eo instanti a free man, end quote. In the third edition, 1768 to 1769, he revised the sentence as follows, quote, falls under the protection of the laws, and so far becomes a free man, though the master's right to his service may possibly still continue, end quote. On February 20th, 1769, Blackstone cautioned Sharp against using the passage from the first edition, quote, as decisive in favor of your doctrine, end quote. Sharp and others had misunderstood Blackstone's position, which should have been clear from a qualification that appeared in the first edition. Quote, yet with regard to any right which the master may have acquired by contract or the like to the perpetual service of John or Thomas, this will remain exactly in the same state as before. The slaves entitled to the same liberty changed to protection in later editions, in England before as after baptism, and whatever service the heathen Negro owed to his English master, the same is he bound to render when a Christian. End quote. Blackstone reportedly told Sharp that a slave service should be likened to an apprenticeship or implied contract. In a letter, he added, quote, that I have never peremptorily said that the master hath acquired any right to the perpetual service of John or Thomas. I only said that if he did, that obligation is not dissolved by his coming to England and turning Christian. End quote. Hargrave tried to challenge this slippery position by repeating Sharp's arguments on coercion annulling any contract, but the Somerset case left the issue unresolved. Slaveholders could not really be content with a claim to service alone. To answer their purpose, as Hargrave made clear, quote, it must be a contract to serve the master here, and when he leaves this country to return with him into America, where the slavery will again attach upon the Negro. End quote. Such needs virtually precluded compromise. As Davy put it, quote, either this man remains upon his arrival in England in the condition he was abroad in Virginia, or he does not. If he does so remain, the master's power remains as before. If the laws having attached upon him abroad are at all to affect him here, it brings them all. Either all the laws of Virginia are to attach upon him here, or none. For where will they draw the line? End quote. In 1749, Lord Hardwicke had taken the absolutist position that a slave's status was in no way changed by coming to England, and had also asserted that trover could apply to a villein, an opinion later rejected by Estwick and other defenders of slavery, since trover implied unlimited ownership of personal property. Hardwicke's extremism made it easier for Davy to swing to the opposite pole and to claim, in words that would be popularly interpreted as the verdict of the Somerset decision, that the air of England was, quote, too pure for a slave to breathe in, end quote. There was still another way in which discussions of villenage favored the cause of liberty. Though English lawyers often showed traditional restraint in approaching the subject of progress, the Somerset case provided an irresistible opportunity to review the entire history of civil liberty. Quote, it is the pride of this country, Davy said, that it looks upon all other countries in a bad light, as this is the only country where they are free. End quote. If Englishmen had once suffered from tyranny and had been destroyed, quote, by the genius of the people, end quote, followed by another quote, quote, what is most striking in the present enquiry is that the people themselves and the interpreters and oracles of the law who were the judges, they in all ages seem to have revolted against villenage, end quote. An infamous law to enslave rogues and vagabonds under Edward VI had been repealed by Parliament, for bondage, quote, was a state which an English mind revolts at. The English Constitution could not bear that any set of men, under any circumstances, should be put in such a state in this country, end quote. And since the reign of Elizabeth, the laws and air of England had become gradually purer. Sergeant Glynn warned that the issue at hand involved far more than the liberty of an individual. Quote, it would be injurious to and affect the general system, violating one of the most fundamental principles of that constitutional liberty. It will be productive of consequences prejudicial to the peace and dangerous to the liberty of the kingdom if once introduced. End quote. Hold on just one second. Bear with me, sorry. Sorry. Okay. Just double checking where I needed to stop for the night. Let me get back to where I was now. If once introduced. Okay. Sorry about that. Forgot where my stopping point was. It was one thing, however, to celebrate the disappearance of villanage and the extension of civil liberty, and quite another to define the proper limits of personal dominion. In Scotland, for example, the case of Knight versus Wedderburn, 1777 and 8, brought a renewed appreciation for the statute of 1701, quote, for preventing wrongness per imprisonment and against undue delays in trials, end quote. A law which was said to be far more favorable to liberty than the Habeas Corpus Act of England. Yet even the defendants of Joseph Knight, the Jamaican Negro taken to Scotland, insisted that society required a degree of subordination within certain specified boundaries. If the idea of slavery seemed antithetical to the emerging ideology of contractual relations in a free society, jurists were also reluctant to endorse any far reaching principles which might encourage insubordination or undermine mercantilist theories of manpower and public policy. As an alternative, they searched for ways to accommodate the ideal of freedom with social utility. Thus, at the conclusion of Lewis versus Stapleton, 1771, Lord Mansfield expressed the following opinion on the legality of holding men as property in England. Quote, I hope it never will be finally discussed, for I would have all masters think they were free and all Negroes think they were not, because then they would both behave better. End quote. It is naive to read the judicial cases as clear-cut struggles between the champions of freedom and the self-interested defenders of slavery. Both sides were caught in an internal conflict between utility as defined by the propertied classes and an allegiance to the principles of freedom and contract as expounded by Locke, Montesquieu, and Blackstone. The the later sources provided Davy and Hargrave with a strong theoretical indictment of slavery in any form, yet they significantly compromised themselves by admitting the legality of slavery in America. Quote, by an unhappy concurrence of circumstances, the slavery of Negroes is thought to have become necessary in America, and therefore in America our legislature has permitted the slavery of Negroes, but the slavery of Negroes is unnecessary in England. End quote. If it had proved necessary, Hargrave's libertarian arguments would presumably have lost their force. Contract and consent toward a free labor ideology. The compromise between utility and principles becomes less mystifying when one examines some further implications of contract and consent. Hargrave held that, quote, the law of England may perhaps give effect to a contract of service for life, but that is the ne plus ultra of servitude by contract in England. It will not permit the servant to incorporate into his contract the ingredients of slavery. End quote. Somerset's counsel, following Montesquieu, Blackstone, and Sharp, argued that every sale implies a price, quote, an equivalent given to the seller in lieu of what he transfers to the buyer, end quote. In the case of slavery, however, quote, the buyer gives nothing and the seller receives nothing, end quote. Phrased positively and closer to the famous position of Locke, liberty is a priceless and inalienable possession, essential to self-preservation. In Knight v. Wedderburn, these principles led to the conclusion that the law of England would not support a voluntary contract for lifetime service without wages, that, quote, the defender had no right to the Negro's service for any space of time, end quote. Nambro, hey, welcome. How are you doing? It's been a while. Good to see you. No doubt the intent of such judgments was to protect the liberty of potential self-sellers, although, according to Rousseau, only a madman could truly consent to any form of subordination, and in Rousseau's eyes the myth of consent disguised the fraud and coercion that kept most of mankind in bondage. The justifications for slavery were no more absurd than the justifications for all forms of privilege and inequality. One need not be a Rousseauist to see the ideological importance of the no self sale doctrine. If English and Scottish courts had admitted that a man might legitimately consent to become a slave, they would have jeopardized all the legal fictions concerning quote unquote voluntary labor. The fictions so essential for separating status from tenure and for redistributing legal liability. No worker, said the courts, could sell himself and then become perpetually dependent. But a worker who accepted token wages could be defined as free, even if in fact he remained perpetually dependent. Obviously, many men and women have voluntarily degraded themselves for a price. It was not fortuitous, however, that juristic arguments against slavery sometimes included defenses of extreme forms of labor dependency. A remarkable example appears in the memorials or quote unquote informations presented by eminent Scottish jurists in Knight versus Wedderburn. Both sides agreed that certain Scottish colliers and salters had been bound for life in the coal mines and salt works where they labored, that such workers were not free to change employment and were sold by owners along with the property. Although this practice was abolished by statute in 1775, at almost precisely the time when the memorials were written, the jurists did not condemn industrial slavery as a violation of human rights. Rather, they debated whether Marco Polo had seen coal before traveling to China, and whether Scotland, quote, was very much covered with wood during the reigns of the Jameses, end quote. The purpose of these odd digressions was to prove either that industrial bondage was a fairly recent innovation or that it derived from ancient villeinage. I did not know, just a little aside, this is really not that important, but I'm going to say it anyway. I didn't know that the term collier meant that you were a coal miner. I have heard that term several times before. In fact, there's a song about the collier's wife, and I didn't know what it meant. Now I do. I like it when I learn something new. Judge Alan McConaughey, afterwards Lord Meadowbank, who supported the cause of Joseph Knight, contended that the binding of miners and salters was of recent origin and could not be used to show the continuation or extension of the laws of villeinage. The condition of colliers and salters was simply the product of economic expediency and could not be construed as giving general sanction to the principle of slavery, since McConaughey's defensive arguments were linked with anti-slavery principles. They were worth quoting at some length. Nambro says, I didn't know that either. I don't think it's a very common word nowadays. Like I said, I've heard it, and there is a song called something about the collier's wife, and I've heard it, and it's actually a cool kind of traditional song, but Didn't know what a collier's wife was. I knew what the collier's wife was. Didn't know what the collier was. Okay. Um, Back to our quote. Quote, in the infancy of improvement, men are apt to adopt expedients for removing the obstructions it meets with, and other evils which they feel, but the nature and effectual remedies of which they do not comprehend. Thus, in corporations and monopolies on the one hand, and on the other, restraints on the members of incorporations and on monopolies have originated. In the same way, it was very natural to seek a curb for the indolence or capriciousness of colliers, whose high wages, like those of many other kinds of workmen, disposed them to idleness, faction, or arrogance. All regulations, however, framed with such views, are evidently commercial and never can be construed as either favoring liberty or slavery, and more than the act of navigation or any other thing of the same nature. End quote. And just going back to the Collier's thing real quick, the modern spelling of it is Colliers, but in that quote, he spells it Colliers, Coalliers. If it was still spelled that way, it would make more sense, and it would be kind of a self-evident what it meant. There's something to be said about the less rigid spelling conventions of the past. By defining such bondage as commercial regulation, McConaughey sought to insulate it from moral criticism. The question was purely one of economic improvement and labor discipline and had no bearing on personal rights or dominion. Utility alone was the guide. Quote, the art of making coal successfully requires long practice to attain and is prejudicial to the health of those who are not early accustomed to it. It was therefore extremely natural, when coal works were begun to be set on foot, that the proprietors should, in return for the high wages they gave the workmen, take them bound to continue in their service for a long term of years or for life. Accordingly, we find that it was at first customary to take such bonds from colliers, and it is known that the practice continued after the intervention of Parliament had superseded the necessity of it. End quote. Obviously, this argument echoed the West Indian planters' claims that field labor would be, quote, prejudicial to the health, end quote, of white men, that the labor needs of plantation economy could only be met by Negro slaves, and that bondage was a necessary curb on indolence, faction, and arrogance. This was precisely the utilitarian and quote-unquote commercial mentality that gave British plantation slavery its shamelessly exploitive character. In most respects, McConaughey, I don't know, I'm having trouble with this guy's names. McConaughey, one more time. In most respects, McConaughey's apology for industrial bondage was like a caricature of the pro-slavery argument. Indeed, no West Indian could quite match two of McConaughey's absurdities. He gravely insisted that a Scottish collier, some of whom wore collars bearing their owners' names, was, quote, capable of being elected a member of Parliament, end quote. He also claimed that lawyers were as much slaves, quote unquote, as colliers, since lawyers were sometimes obliged to plead cases whether they wished to or not. Don't even get me started on lawyers. The significant point, however, is not McConaughey's insensitivity, but his conviction that the wages signified freedom. A collier might be sold with the mine to which he was bound for life, but his quote-unquote high wages meant that he belonged to a, quote, profession which is voluntarily embraced, end quote. Even though, as McConaughey admitted the profession was, quote, prejudicial to the health of those who are not early accustomed to it, end quote, which meant that workers were virtually colliers from birth. A similar conclusion had been advanced in 1771 by John Miller, the brilliant professor of civil law at the University of Glasgow, a social theorist who greatly strengthened the economic argument against West Indian slavery. The Scottish colliers, Millar argued, would not suffer such degradation unless they received more sustenance than they would as free workers. Millar considered this bondage an archaic and expensive system of labor, but he was willing to make allowance for the mine owners' acceptance of inflated labor costs. Such economic waste could be explained by the temporary need for concentrating and supervising labor in one place. These examples highlight the importance of wages as a symbol of exchange and thus of voluntarism, even in a situation of nearly absolute subordination. For anti-slavery advocates like Millar and McConaughey, it was not the slave's subordination or lack of mobility that ran contrary to nature. It was rather the lack of any token of exchange which would make the worker responsible, at least theoretically, for his own destiny. Of course, one might object that the slave received sustenance in exchange for labor, and that according to Millar and his mentor Adam Smith, this sustenance would probably amount to more than would be paid in wages for the same work performed. The amount of compensation, however, was not the issue. Indeed, for the advocates of laissez-faire, any guaranteed compensation, no matter how minimal, was as much a brake on progress as were other economic privileges. One finds a certain arbitrariness in the anti-slavery distinction between wages and sustenance. Hargrave, for example, paraphrased Grotius's definition of slavery as, quote, an obligation to serve another for life in consideration of being supplied with the bare necessities of life, end quote. His own definition, however, totally evaded the question of exchange, and although Hargrave focused on the injustice of absolute and hereditary subordination, he dealt cautiously with the prestigious jurists who had argued for the utility of a limited domestic slavery as an antidote for the unemployment and domestic disorder. For unemployment and domestic. When one looks closer to the legal arguments against slavery, the quote-unquote inconsistencies begin to form a pattern. Ideological needs define the meanings and limits of voluntarism. One could begin with Montesquieu, who provided jurists with a basic arsenal of anti-slavery arguments, and who also mapped the routes of compromise. Montesquieu's logic demolished all the classical justifications for slavery and thus weakened appeals to tradition. But when he shifted from abstract syllogisms to specific cases, Montesquieu conceded that slavery might be found on natural reason in tropical countries where the heat made men lazy and unwilling to do heavy work except in fear of punishment. In Europe, he said, there were more effective inducements to voluntary labor. Blackstone repeated Montesquieu's arguments on consent and contract, but he also held that an American master might have a lawful right to the perpetual service of his slave, a right which would take the form of an implied contract in England. The analogy Blackstone used is of particular significance. Quote, for this is no more than the same state of subjection for life which every apprentice submits to for the space of 7 years, or sometimes for a longer term. End quote. These rather enigmatic words acquire more meaning when juxtaposed with the remarks of John Dunning, the former Solicitor General who had worked with Granville Sharp in Lewis versus Stapleton, who took the opposite side 1 year later in the Somerset case, and who was, according to William Holdsworth, quote, universally acknowledged to be at the head of the common law and equity bars, end quote. In defending Stuart, Dunning first elaborated on the distinction implicit in Montesquieu and Blackstone between an existing relationship and its origin. Quote, whichever way it was formed, the consequences, good or ill, follow from the relation, not the manner of producing it. End quote. He then turned to the fiction of voluntarism. Quote, I may observe there is an establishment by which magistrates compel idle or dissolute persons of various ranks and denominations to serve. In the case of apprentices bound out by the parish, neither the trade is left to the choice of those who are to serve, nor the consent of parties necessary. No contract therefore is made in the former instance, none in the latter. The duty remains the same. End quote. He added, quote, our legislature, where it finds a relation existing, supports it in all suitable consequences, without using to inquire how it commenced. A man enlists for no specified time. The contract in construction of law is for a year. The legislature, when once the man is enlisted, interposes annually to continue in the service as long as the public has need of him. In times of public danger he is forced into the service, as much and as absolutely as if by contract he had so disposed of himself. End quote. We're almost to the stopping point for the night. A couple more pages here. Dunning's example shows that even in England there were not always sufficient inducements to voluntary labor. The actual status of many British workers could be described, quote, as if by contract, end quote. They had accepted perpetual dependency. To condemn Dunning's respect for useful existing relationships out of a concern for abstract justice might well lead to the conclusions of Rousseau. On the other hand, it could always be argued that vagabonds, apprentices, and sailors were much freer than slaves, and that therefore miners and factory workers were by comparison truly free men. The Somerset and Knight cases reinforced Britain's reputation as a free country, and seemed to confirm Blackstone's famous maxim that the spirit of liberty was so deeply rooted in the very soil of Britain that even a Negro, the moment he set foot on the land, came under the protection of British laws. But the domestic implications of quote-unquote outlawing slavery extended much further. The growth of Negro slavery in Britain would clearly have threatened public order as well as the emerging free labor ideology. Somerset's counsel emphasized the danger of augmenting the existing and free-floating population of some 14,000 to 15,000 blacks who were termed, quote, foreign superfluous inhabitants, a nation of enemies in the heart of the state, end quote. When Sergeant Davy exclaimed that the air of England was too pure for a slave to breathe in, he was not inviting more slaves to come and breathe the freedom-giving air. He made it clear that the air of England was also too pure for a Negro to breathe in. He wished to prevent the influx of Negroes, quote, for now and then we have some accidents of children born of an odd color, end quote. Okay. Unless a law were passed to prevent such immigration, Davy said, quote, I don't know what our progeny may be. I mean of what color. A free man of this country may in the course of time be the grandfather of half a score of slaves for what we know. End quote. Negroes, in short, should be kept where they belonged, in the West Indies. Quote, there are sufficient laws in all the plantations to prevent slaves being brought over. There can be no danger of a man's escaping and so coming into this country. End quote. Davies suggested to Lord Mansfield a highly revealing distinction. Quote, if the owner of a slave from Africa or America was to bring him into this country, if he comes with his master into this country, the master himself manumits him, i.e., by accepting the effects of the law. But if he escapes and comes here not being brought by his master, it should not have that operation. End quote. By the 1770s, there was a growing fear of the abandonment and unemployed, I'm sorry, Let me start that sentence again. By the 1770s, there was a growing fear of the abandoned and unemployed blacks in London. There was also a distaste for slave auctions and advertisements for runaways and for silver padlocks, quote, for blacks or dogs, end quote. Arguments of Somerset's counsel anticipated the later the the later official policy of deporting Negroes, whose numbers were swollen by veterans and refugees of the American Revolution, to the new colony of Sierra Leone. It is notable that in 1773 Portugal forbade the entry of Brazilian slaves or free blacks who were said to constitute unfair competition to domestic labor. In 1777 France issued a royal decree prohibiting the immigration of Negroes or mulattoes, whether slave or free. This order followed mounting complaints that blacks were causing disorder in French cities, that they were polluting the blood and debasing the culture of France. The French efforts to outlaw intermarriage and to set up detention camps for blacks suggest that by the 1770s the slave trading nations were approaching common problems with common prejudices. The desire to exclude Negroes often preceded explicit hostility to slavery. Okay, I'm going to finish out this page, and then that will put us at a good stopping point. But the Somerset and Knight cases also helped to define and clarify an emerging free labor ideology. The actual judgments of the courts stopped considerably short of later notions of fundamental liberties. There was great selectivity in identifying the injustices of slavery. No one talked of individual opportunity. No one suggested that servants or workers should be free to be idle or to wander about the countryside. In Knight versus Wedderburn, the court held that since the dominion allowed by Jamaican law was unjust, the master had no right whatever to the Negro's service. Some years after the Knight case, however, Lord Mansfield said that his own decision in Somerset went, quote, no further than that the master cannot by force compel him to go out of the kingdom, end quote. This interpretation is especially striking in light of Mansfield's maxim on positive law, coupled with his statement that, quote, so high an act of dominion must derive its authority, if any such it has, from the law of the kingdom where executed, end quote. The question at issue is whether the limitations imposed on a master's authority in England annihilated all the legal incidents of slave status. And that is where I'm going to stop for the night. We'll finish up the other half of that chapter Tuesday, barring catastrophe. And then we are down to one more chapter and the epilogue. And we will just have to play it by ear and see how far we get each night on that. So, let's see who all is around. If you will, please just stick with us for a minute or two. Say hello to the person we raid, or at least just give them a minute of your time. I see Mr. Blitzer is still on. So is Zeus. I have not been raiding Zeus. He's been, I don't know. I haven't wanted to raid him for a while. Not saying anything bad about him, just hasn't been something I felt I needed to do. Let's see if Mr. Blitzer's still on. Yeah, he's still playing. So I'm going to take us on over there. So bear with me, and I will get us there forthwith. And here we go.